Step number 3 of our project, we're going to be building the legs. And if you notice on the legs, they are tapered. So they go about 1.25 inches thick at the top, and then they get down to about 3/4 of an inch thick at the bottom. And we need to make sure for the legs that we get the thicker boards, which are going to be 2 inches thick. Now the alder is fairly full, so I put the 2-inch thick for alder just right out here leaning against the edge. Now all the rest of them, they should have the 2-inch thick board in there. So the oak, I tried to keep the 1-inch thick stuff on the left-hand side, but then the 2-inch thick stuff is going to be over on the right. And each of those, same with maple, 1 inch is on the left, and then the 2-inch thick is on the right, these big thick ones here. Same thing with cherry, it's going to be on the right, and then walnut, same thing, it's going to be on the right. Your big 2-inch thick boards. So you'll notice if you measured these boards, it's just a hair under 2 inches, maybe 1 7/8 or 1 15/16. That's okay. We only need 1.25 inches, and so just when you go to grab these boards, go ahead and get one of these big, massive boards. Very similar like the previous parts of your project, you're going to need to trim off any cracks or bad end off this board. So this one here doesn't really have many cracks showing, but the end of the board is pretty rough. So we're going to trim off maybe 1 inch or 2 off the edge of that, and we'll just use the upcut saw for this. So just maybe 1 inch or 2 just trimmed off. We're going to need something cut exactly 25 inches long, so you can just turn on our saw gear tiger stop and just type in 25, start. We'll adjust our arm over to exactly 25 and we'll get that piece cut exactly 25 inches long. Again, be careful that you don't slam into that little arm, just gently press it in there. Turn it on. Step on that foot pedal down there, make that slide down. Okay, so the piece that you cut off here 25 inches long, you need to see if you can get 4 legs out of that. And each leg is going to be 1.25 inches wide and 1.25 inches thick and 25 inches long. So if I'm measuring my board here, I'm about 7 inches or so. And so I should be able to get 4 legs out of it. Each are only 1.25 inches wide. Okay, 2 legs are going to be about 2.5, which means 4 legs should be about 5 inches. Plus you have a little bit of waste from the saw blade cutting. So as long as I'm a little bit more than 5 inches, I should be able to get all 4 of my legs out of this. If you couldn't, maybe only get 3 legs or 2, you can go ahead and get another piece cut. Or look in that wood storage room, there might be some extra pieces that are already 25 inches long that were smaller that you can get your additional leg out of. You need to go ahead and joint one edge of this board. Now again, it does not matter which edge you joint, just choose the easiest one. I'm looking at both these. They both look about the same, so it probably doesn't matter, but this one has fewer knots or other defects, so I'm going to go ahead and joint this edge. And with it being a thicker board, it should be the exact same process. Just make sure you look, and if it's taller than the fence, you're okay with just your hands. If it's shorter than the fence, use the push sticks. This one's taller than the fence, so I'm okay. Just run it through. We want to run it as many times as needed until that edge is perfectly flat. Take a look, and I think 1 pass is fine on this, but I could go ahead and run it again if I really wanted to. We're okay with just 1 pass. Okay, the next part is going to come to the table saw, and we're going to need to use the table saw to rip 4 boards 1.25 inches wide. So again, this is going to be getting all 4 of our legs out of this, and you should have that flat jointed edge go up against our fence. We're setting our fence to 1.25 inches. And just make sure again that you understand that on your tape measure on the fence that there are 1/32 of an inch tick marks, and so you need to know where 1.25 inches is when you're setting that fence. Okay, I just wanted to point out on the table saw again, there are really small tick marks. Those are the 1/32 of an inch tick marks. So you have to ignore those when you're going to 1 1/4. You cannot just go 1 and then count 1, 2, 3, 4 tick marks. That is not 1 1/4. That is 1 1/8.
So you have to understand where the 1/4 inch mark is at. And so here's the 1 inch mark, there's your 2 inch mark, okay, right between would be the half, and there's our fourth right there. So 1 1/4 is where we're setting our fence.
Couple reminders, make sure you check your blade height, because the person before you may have been cutting a smaller board, and this blade right here is way lower than what I need, so I do need to make sure I raise up that blade. Again, with that handle on the front of the machine, we're going to get that blade raised up about the height of the teeth above your board. You also need to make sure that you're using a push stick. And I've actually got two different size push sticks here. One of them is 3/4 inch thick, the other one's about a 1/2 inch thick. I would recommend use the one that's a little bit more thin, because this has to fit between the blade and the fence. And your bigger push stick has a harder time, the guard gets in the way a little bit. So this smaller push stick should be able to fit in there just fine without getting in the way. You might be tempted to want to put your push stick on the outside and push out here. Don't do that. You absolutely must have your push stick go between the blade and the fence and push through whatever's being cut off. So we're going to go ahead and get 4 legs cut out of this. Again, that flat jointed edge against our fence. It is thicker boards, so you have to push a little bit harder. You can't cut as easily. You might have to put a little more force as you're making this cut here. We're going to go ahead and get 3 more cuts, same edge against that fence. Last cutoff piece here. Please don't be tempted to reach and grab that. Let that blade stop, and still I would get this and pull it back from the back side so you're not getting anywhere near that blade. So we have 4 legs that are now cut 1.25 inches wide, but they're still 2 inches thick. And so we need to get these things squared. And we could go to the planer and plane this down to 1.25 inches, but we're going to just stay at the table saw, leaving the fence at 1.25 inches. We're going to rotate our board a 1/4 turn and cut this again on the table saw to make it so it ends up being square, 1.25 inches by 1.25 inches on the table saw. If you have any part of your board that you don't like, maybe a knot or other things on your board, you can have that bad part facing out so it gets cut off when we go to cut this. I also have a knot right here. Maybe I don't like that one. I'm going to probably have that knot faced out when I make this cut to make sure it's square, 1.25 inches by 1.25 inches. Rotate it.
You'll notice as I'm making these cuts here that my left hand is holding that board nice and firm against the fence as my right hand does the pushing with the push stick. My left hand is making sure it's keeping the pressure really tight down on the table as well as against the fence.
Okay, as soon as you have all 4 legs cut, and again they are square, 1.25 inches by 1.25 inches, 25 inches long, there's your 4 legs. And on your table, we are going to be having that taper cut into them, because if they're just square and left square, they look a little bit bulky. It's a little bit more aesthetically pleasing if it starts off bigger and gets smaller towards the bottom. And there's multiple ways we can make these tapers on your legs. We could just draw some lines on your board where we want to have it cut, go to the bandsaw, cut carefully on your line, and then sand it down. That works just fine. But we're going to do this actually on the table saw. and which means we need to hold our leg at an angle when we're making a cut on the table saw, which sounds kind of scary, but we have what's called a leg taper jig, which I made that you can hold your board sideways on a table saw safely to make this tapered cut. And on your grain paper it says use the leg taper jig to cut the leg tapers on the table saw. You need to have two edges tapered. And so these two edges are going to be adjacent to each other, meaning they're going to be next to each other. So we don't want to taper with this side and then the opposite side. They're going to be two edges that are next to each other. And then we also kind of look at your leg and say, is there anything on your leg you don't like? I got some burn marks here a little bit, there's some knots or other things. And so this you can consider having, again, face out when you make this cut, so those get cut off. So it starts off and cuts off any of the bad part that we don't like. Now to use the taper jig, on your paper it says set the fence to 2 3/4. This is important because if you don't set the fence, if you leave it at 1 1/4, well, like it is now, and you try to use this jig, you're going to end up cutting my jig in half. And actually a student already started to cut my jig in half right here, that's why it's been cut. So we need to make sure, please set the fence to 2 3/4 on this before we make our cuts. So we've got it set at 2 3/4, and we'll show you how to hold your board on the taper jig in order to make this cut. Okay, on your jig, you've got a little block at the very bottom here, and on the other side it says this side against the fence. You need to make sure this goes nice and tight on that fence. Your leg is just going to go right up against our little block right here. And again, we're going to do two edges tapered, so if you have something like a burn mark or knot, or this one has a little split at the board, again, I'm going to have that facing out, so that gets cut off as we make these cuts. And we're going to cut it twice. So once we'll cut here, and then we're going to rotate our board and cut it a second edge off as well on this. Make sure you hold the leg and the jig tight together when you make these cuts, that you don't have these separate or come across or anything like that. And treat it as if it's one board. So you're going to make sure it's all nice and tight on the fence and that leg is held nice and firm here. You definitely need to use a push stick because your fence is set at 2 3/4. And so your push stick is actually going to go on the jig, not hooking onto the leg. Otherwise it just pushes your leg only. So we've got to make sure the jig and the leg go at the same time. So if you push the jig, it'll push the leg with it. So you'll notice when I'm using that jig also, or with that push stick also. Hold them together nice and firm. We're going to turn this on. Again, our fence is set at 2 3/4. Nice and tight on the fence. Don't let it come away. And it's not even cutting anything yet. My blade is not even hitting the leg just yet. And it will. It'll start hitting closer about right here. So you start pushing, and then you want to make sure your push stick gets hooked onto the jig. And it'll push that all the way through with your leg and everything. Go nice and slow. Cut that off. You will notice that every single time you make this cut, you're going to get this little scrap of wood right here that gets kind of pulled in by the blade. Make sure that blade is off and stopped before you grab that piece out of there. Do not try to grab this piece out with that blade still spinning. We can pull that little wedge out. Again, every single cut you make, you're going to have that little wedge left over. And actually, I want you to save these. There is a cardboard box that'll have you put these in, because we're going to need these little wedges when we go to glue up our table later on. So save those. Okay, again, after you've cut one side, you need to make sure you rotate your leg a quarter turn. So I've cut it once, and all I'm doing is just going to turn my leg a quarter turn to make my second cut. If you take your leg and you flip your leg around, that's going to cut the taper on the other side too, so we don't want that. So make sure your leg and your jig are still together. We've made one cut, we're just going to rotate it a quarter turn and make that second cut the exact same. Push stick on the jig. Now if you can reach right here and pinch that little piece and pull that straight back out, that's fine. But again, never reach right next to the blade when you're going to remove that piece. There we go. Our leg now has two edges tapered. So it starts off thicker at the top and it gets smaller down towards the bottom. And we need to do the same process to all four of our legs. Some of you are going to be using boards that have quite a few knots and other things in them, and those are fine. If some of the knots are big open knots and your leg, if you were to set your leg down and put some pressure on here and it snaps, obviously we can make a new leg. But for the most part, don't worry about the knots. Burn marks, we're going to get rid of those by sanding the legs later, but let's go ahead and get the other three legs all tapered. Looking at it, there's some burn marks starting to have that face out. Run that through, push stick on the jig. Little piece we can push out of there. I can't get it, so we're going to let that stop fully. Lift that up. Once the blade's fully stopped, we can get that piece out of there. Again, we're going to rotate our board a quarter turn. Cut it again. That one's done. Okay, two edges tapered. Grab that piece from the back, that's fine, but never grab it next to the blade. Rotate. And there we go, we've got all four of our legs tapered. And each one again has two edges tapered. That's all we're doing on each one. It's just two of the edges tapered. Next is going to have us sand off any of the burn marks or saw blade marks and remove that. So a few of these have some burn marks or some other things on them. There's some saw blade marks. So we just want to get these all smoothed up with our sanders. Okay, if your legs have some pretty big burns in them, we can use our horizontal belt sander to sand this. Again, we would just press this up against our belt. Watch your fingertips, that you don't get your fingers or your knuckles hitting into that belt. I do have this block of wood right here that's helpful to put your board up against, and then you can keep your hands behind it as you're putting the pressure on the belt. But we want to make sure as we're sanding this, we're just getting it nice and smooth and flat. The edge that has the taper, so it's pretty flat here and then it tapers down, we want to make sure we keep that taper, so as you're sanding one side here, we keep it flat, but then right here it's not touching. So we also have to put some pressure on the tapered side, but again, we want to keep that taper. We don't want it to be just we don't want to get rid of the corner here. And so just watch your fingers as you're doing this. Green button will turn it on. I'm keeping my hands out of the way, and over here I'll put some pressure on that part. Watch your fingers, that sandpaper is pretty aggressive, so we just got all the burn marks off. Now this side again has a burn mark, put some pressure on here. Now this one's all flat, the whole thing, so we can keep the pressure on the entire thing. You don't want to press so hard that it ruins the belt, but give enough pressure that you can start to remove some burn marks. I still have more I need to remove there. So I can put a little more pressure on that part where the burn is at. Again, watch your fingertips so you don't hit into that belt. And this will get rid of those burns fairly quickly. Now if you press too hard, you're actually going to add another burn mark into your leg. So you just want to give enough pressure that it gets rid of the burn, but doesn't add any more. Again, this way, Just rotate it around and get all four sides sanded. So here, sanded, and I'm putting some pressure over here. And you can do that on all your legs. Little red button will shut it off. We're not worried about final sanding yet. We're just removing saw blade marks and burn marks on our horizontal belt sander. We do have two sides of the belt. So if you want to use this side over here instead, it does not have that little block of wood on this side, so it's a little harder to hold onto your board. I'd probably recommend use the side that has the block of wood, but you could use both sides if you wanted to. Okay, now if your legs don't have really big burns, like these ones didn't really get burned at all, a little bit here, maybe a few little saw marks, we don't really need to go over to that horizontal belt sander unless it's a really deep, dark burn mark. So most of you are just going to use what are called random orbit sanders. And we've got a couple different kinds. These are in the tool cabinet. This one is just an electric one you can just plug in. Just got some sandpaper on here. That's just Velcro that you can hook on. The other ones we have are pneumatic, meaning that they are powered by the compressed air. So we can plug an air hose in here. Again, the sandpaper, this is just a sticker that can stick onto these. And so we can use these to sand our legs with. I have these little carpet pieces underneath the glue table that you can use anytime you're needing to sand. To prevent your board from vibrating a lot on the bench top, you can put this piece of carpet down on, and then when you're sanding it's going to get rid of a lot of that vibration. So I'd recommend using that. If you're using the pneumatic sanders, these little air hoses that are hanging down from the bench tops need to be connected. And how to connect this, it's got this little silver coupling right here, and if you pull this part back, so you have to pull that back with one hand and then you can press it on to the sander and then press that silver coupling forward and that'll hook it on. Now to remove it, you have to kind of push the sander on a little harder and then you can pull that little silver coupling back and it'll just come off. So we'll connect that on, and then to start the sander you just press on top and that'll spin as we go. So we just want to get the whole thing sanded, removing saw blade marks and burn marks. It doesn't take very much. You're just, again, removing just the burn marks or saw blade marks. Don't round over your corners. You want to leave your corners sharp. So we're not rounding those over with the sander. All we're doing, again, is just removing any burn marks or saw marks. Okay, now once you've got all four of your legs sanded, and there's no burn marks on them, all the saw blade marks are off, and again, this could be done either on the horizontal belt sander or using one of the random orbit sanders. So you don't have to do both. You can do one or the other when you're sanding these. Make sure you get your name on every board again. Now don't worry, if we just sanded it, you're going to write your name on it again, and that's okay. You may even want to write it up on the top end of your board up here so you don't have to do as much sanding. But get your name on every single board, and then come get my signature on your green paper when you're done.